When Florida's reef is threatened by disease, teams around the country partner up to save the lost coral of Key West.
Welcome to Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom.
Wild Kingdom is back. Hi, I'm Peter Gros, and these are real conservation success stories from across the USA. I can't wait to share these all-new inspiring tales of protecting the wild. Now, some people think of coral as a pretty rock in the ocean, but the truth is, coral is a living animal that eats, sleeps, and gives birth to new life. These reef builders create tropical ocean neighborhoods that become some of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the entire world.
Even though 3/4 of our Earth's surface is covered by water, that's the part of the Wild Kingdom that has had the least exploration. But there are certain places that have given us glimpses into this watery world. These are the coral islands and the nearby reefs, here in the Gulf waters off Florida's southern coast.
Florida's coral reef is 356 nautical miles, so from Port St. Lucie all the way down to the dry Tortugas, and so it's a pretty large reef span. We rely on it for tourism, fishing, food, and then for those of us who live here, the reef provides a very valuable protection against storms.
It's nature's barrier to protect our beaches and our coastlines. The wave energy from storms breaks on the coral reef rather than right on our beaches and condos along the coast.
If we had a 25-foot wall of water on land, there would be nothing left.
We're at Lou Key Marine Sanctuary, a popular diving destination near Key West, Florida. Today I'm working with a team from Mote Marine Laboratory to outplant coral, grown here in their field nursery, back to the critically endangered reef. Coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean's floor, but are vital to a quarter of all marine life. And this project is part of a massive nationwide effort to save them from extinction. To understand how this began, we start with a simple question. What is a coral reef?
That is anything but a simple question. A coral reef is one of the most complex and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. There's sponges, octocorals, ascidians, all manner of critters, including algae, that make up this very interesting, intricate, complex community of organisms that somehow live in what amounts to a desert.
The ocean floor is vast and barren, but coral reefs are the rainforest of the sea. It can take up to 10,000 years for a coral reef to form, and hard corals are the lead engineer of these important structures.
Florida's coral reef is built on a foundation of itself. It naturally gets that foundation through its skeleton that it excretes.
The structure itself is the fossil skeleton of coral animals.
But wait, isn't coral just a rock?
A lot of people think coral is just a rock or a plant. It's an animal. It has tentacles, it has a mouth, it eats food, it captures plankton, and beneath of it is a solid rock that it produces.
They've laid down hundreds of thousands or millions of years worth of calcium carbonate, essentially what is a limestone structure on top of which there's a very thin veneer of living coral tissue.
So as it grows over time, it grows up and lays down rock below it. So it's an animal on the surface, but it has a plant that lives inside of it. So there's that.
So it's an animal and a plant? Anything else?
Many people refer to it as the zoo-phyte light. Zoo for animal, phyte for plant, because these animals inside their tissues actually incorporate an algae that does photosynthesis. So it's part animal, part vegetable, and then light, it's a mineral, because it's depositing this hard calcium carbonate skeleton. So it's got aspects of animal, vegetable, and rock. They're an enigma inside of a puzzle.
Well, I'm glad we cleared that up. So what happened to Florida's coral reef, and how much is even left?
25 to 60% of the actual reef matrix should be covered in living coral tissue. The last survey that went up and down the entire Florida reef tract came back with something less than 2%.
When I was young, you could see live coral and fish right off the beach in Fort Lauderdale. Different wildlife and fish and colors. And then going back there 15 years later, it was hard to find a living coral on those reefs.
Because of disease, because of warming waters, because of ocean acidification, our reef has just continued to decline, and it's declined to the point of extinction.
The effects of climate change have shown up. Marine diseases are becoming more and more frequent and diverse. New ones are showing up every year. Stony coral tissue loss disease resulted in substantial mortality of the corals on the reef.
We still don't know what that disease is. Many scientists have been searching for this for several years now. We still don't have a pathogen identified.
With so much coral already lost, a new disease spreading rapidly among what remains was certain to be the end. And with the coral goes the reef.
So when corals aren't putting calcium down on the reef, erosion is still taking place. So we're actually flattening our reefs and slowly losing them through time.
So it's really important to protect these corals so that they can continue to build those reefs, and those reefs don't just start decaying and crumbling to the ground.
So government agencies, private companies, and marine experts are stepping up to save the Florida Reef Tract before it's too late.
Our nursery is about 1 acre in size. We've got about 250 structures. We call them coral trees. So you can take a small cutting like this, hang these, and basically we create fragments from an original parent colony that will grow to this size in about a year.
Mote Marine Laboratory has been working on restoration for well over 10 years of Florida's coral reef. We restore coral using asexual reproduction, which is where we take pieces and cut them or break them, grow them in our land-based nursery or our water-based nursery until they're at that max amount that we need them to be before we can outplant them on the reef.
This staghorn coral and its relative, the elkhorn coral, were the first Caribbean species listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened in 2006. Not only do they grow 4 times faster in our nursery than they do in the wild, the way that we outplant, we put multiple small fragments in close proximity, and they'll actually fuse back together because they're clones in a very short period of time.
Some species grow better on the land, others grow better out in the water. And so by us having these 2 different types of nurseries, we can really maximize the potential growth for each individual coral.
When we come back, we'll learn how experts are tackling this problem and witness the birth of brand new baby coral. So don't move. You're watching Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, protecting the wild. Florida's coral reef was once a thriving habitat, but today it is almost extinct. Human impact, climate change, and disease have left these aquatic rainforests in dire need of help. Sadly, the situation was made worse when a deadly new virus spread like wildfire through the coral community. Stony coral tissue loss disease.
The disease was first seen off the southeast coast of Florida in 2014. If they didn't do something, we were going to lose our entire ecosystem off the coast of Florida.
And unlike many things that can run away and escape, corals are sort of stuck where they are. They can't pick up and move because the conditions aren't great.
Researchers, state managers, federal partners got together and decided, let's make this incredible plan to remove corals from the reef tract ahead of the disease front and place them into safe holding.
So our state and government colleagues asked the Association of Zoos and Aquariums to engage its constituency and put together a program whereby we could bring these at-risk corals into safe environments such as the Florida Coral Rescue Center in order to preserve the species and the genetics so that ultimately their offspring could be moved back out onto the reef.
And so we started developing systems around the country. And at the same time, state managers were going out onto the reef ahead of the known disease front, and they began removing corals.
These corals were actually taken out of the ocean to bring onto land into aquariums for safekeeping, so they weren't affected by the disease.
And then the exodus began, shipping them overland by plane to facilities around the country.
The Florida Reef Tract Rescue Project was underway, and AZA facilities across 14 states began taking in rescued coral. In Orlando, the Florida Coral Rescue Center houses 18 species across 700 individuals. Their time here allows scientists to collect and preserve a library of DNA or gene banks to aid future restoration. And these corals are quite pampered.
Everything is very controlled as far as the temperature, the water chemistry, the lighting, the flow that they're getting. We all very carefully control it so that the corals have the optimum conditions that they need to thrive. We try and keep the water chemistry very stable for them. This test is a titration test, so she's going to drop this into that vial there and the color will change for each drop. And we're gonna try and get to this purple color here, and that's the end point where we can read what the alkalinity is. That's pretty much purple there, so that looks pretty good.
So now that we've brought those corals in, they're in safekeeping, they are thriving, now it's time to move to the next step. Our colleagues at the Florida Aquarium have already pioneered and taken us in the direction that we all need to go, and that's coral propagation.
We were just going to act as a gene bank for these corals, meaning just keeping the parents alive. But we had to do something more. So we started working on how do we get these corals to spawn.
Spawning is a magical, mysterious process. Conditions must be perfect, and with so many variables at play, collecting spores from the wild is virtually impossible. But in the lab, these conditions can be simulated to promote spawning in a controlled environment and even help restore their lost rhythm.
What we've started seeing over the last few years is that they're no longer being synchronized. Some coral are spawning on one night and another coral is spawning on a different night, and they're not close enough together to ever find each other. That's catastrophic, and that's why we've had to take on some of those sexual reproduction cycles in the lab.
Sure enough, in 2019, we did it for the first time with the Atlantic pillar coral, which is one of the most threatened species we have in Florida. We realized, like, this is the direction we have to go. This is going to be big.
This is the place where you make magic happen.
Yes, this is our coral spawning laboratory. These corals basically think that they're living in the ocean in Key Largo, Florida, because these LED lights, they come on and off with sunrise and sunset. This tank alone can make about 700,000 coral larvae every spawning event. And then we take those larvae down to our greenhouses where they'll settle and then grow into tiny baby corals. So that little torpedo looking thing right there is a baby coral. These larvae were released last night. Within a day or two, they'll flatten out, start to build a skeleton, and actually turn into a primary coral polyp with a mouth in the center and a ring of tentacles around the mouth.
That is so tiny.
They are, and this is actually big. So in the relative scale of coral larvae, these are huge.
These huge larvae are now in search of a place to settle and call home.
So we're going to release baby coral 1, 2, and 3. These are our settlement tiles that have a nice film of algae on them that helps that little baby know that this is a reef environment.
So that'll send out a chemical signal that you should attach here, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And now they'll swim around in there, probe the bottom like we saw under the microscope, and hopefully settle and turn into baby coral.
Get to work in there now. Zooxanthellae is a type of algae that has a symbiotic relationship with coral. It lives inside the tissue, giving coral its unique color. But certain algae grows much faster and can smother babies if it tries to move in too fast. So the team has to carefully manage the lawn on each tile, one at a time, by hand.
And because they do settle so densely, only a fraction of that will survive to outplanting size. 0.001% maybe would survive in the wild, whereas we can get, 25% to survive to adulthood.
I think we settled
30,000 this year?
30,000 this year.
Of this one species.
Amazing. It's a lot of work, but it's paying off.
So these are pillar coral babies. Right here in this tank, actually, we have more genetic individuals than on Florida's coral reef at the moment. The hope is that we can take the 99 different genetic individuals that we have and produce the next generation for restoration.
Sexual reproduction is only a part of the process toward restoring the reef. Coral also grows through asexual reproduction, and to master this process, new techniques would have to be learned, one way or another.
These corals have been very restricted in their ability to be collected for anything other than research since the 1970s. While we knew at our facilities a lot about Indo-Pacific corals, we knew very little about these particular corals from our backyard. So the learning curve started.
At Moat, we uncovered a technique called microfragmentation, and it was really developed by accident by a scientist named Dr. David Vaughn. He accidentally discovered that you can break massive species of coral, and that accelerated growth 40 times faster than they would naturally grow in the wild.
So the idea is once we split it, it's going to grow that much faster?
Yeah, by cutting them, we're increasing that tissue growth, which is exactly the same idea as if you cut your skin and it grows back faster. It's exactly what we're doing to the coral today.
So let's see if we can do this without cutting your skin.
So when we cut our skin goes into overdrive to scab over and create brand new skin. But it doesn't do that all the time. It does that as a response to being hurt. And we think the coral has that same reaction because when we cut it, it starts sheeting out that tissue as fast as possible, probably as a response of being hurt or cut, and that acts to our favor in restoration.
Okay, there we go.
Exactly. Give them a little baste off because you can see that sediment build up. Excellent.
Okay. And there it is.
You did it.
That's what's ready to be
Okay,
glued.
so now,
And
nice done. Perfect.
Good job.
Now you can show it.
look at that.
You just did microfragmentation, Peter.
Microfragmentation. When we come back, we'll learn how experts work to future-proof the coral reef, and I get to outplant some coral back to the wild. You're watching Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, protecting the wild. It's a beautiful day here in the Florida Keys, and we're collecting homegrown staghorn coral from the Moat Marine Lab's field nursery. These pieces will be planted on the reef just a few miles away. That was fantastic down there to see these growing on your man-made trees and flourishing.
Yeah, you can see though, it takes a little bit of work. You can see we try to get a little piece that you can, like a stem. And what we're gonna do when we get out to the reef, something as simple as putting in a masonry nail. This low-tech method we found has proven highly successful. We'll actually attach this coral right to the nail, and then it's going to stay in place, and it will naturally grow itself down onto the reef. So we don't have to use any kind of cement or epoxy or anything.
And that's the way that we work with staghorn corals. That coral will quickly grow up and create a really nice thicket for fish and other things to travel through.
Meanwhile, the elkhorn coral will grow a bit longer in the tanks before being returned to the wild. So this is all exactly the same species.
Yep.
So have we basically cloned coral doing it like this?
Yeah, so we've cloned quite a few corals, and that's really important because when we put them out on the reef, we want to put them in groups of the same clone. That way when they sheet out, end up touching each other, recognizing each other, and that's when they fuse.
That's an important step, carefully planned inch by inch across the reef for a variety of species. It sure needs the help. The scattered patchwork of coral here is few and far between.
It's pretty hard to see the reef in the condition that it's in. There's not a whole lot out there. There's a lot of rubble, a lot of algae. There's not enough of the reef out there left to naturally repopulate itself.
If you have a mommy coral and a daddy coral and they're too far apart, the probability that their offspring are going to get fertilized becomes less and less. It's something that we call Allee effects. They're very susceptible to Allee effects.
Any population that can't repopulate itself through sexual reproduction, that's the end of that population, and we can't afford for that to happen.
The network of talented people and their techniques for reproduction have proven successful in the lab. Once returned to the wild, they're on their own and need to fend for themselves. So the next problem is algae.
We've had an overgrowth of algae, which tends to happen when you have a lack of coral out there.
But algae is good for the reef, right?
Algae are the solar panels of the reef. That is where we get solar energy that then transmits up those different trophic levels. So without algae, we would not have a coral reef. We would not have the biodiversity that coral reefs support around the world.
Like a well-manicured lawn, the reef needs good landscapers. So the team at Moat has started breeding a few of those too.
Herbivores like Caribbean king crabs and other crabs that come in and eat algae have never been more important.
These guys eat algae, which is a competitor of corals on the reef. Eating and removing algae that other herbivores don't, these guys allow corals to grow faster, larger, and we hope reproduce earlier.
We call them the goats of the sea. They're sort of the lawnmowers, if you will. And so they're really great at keeping a whole reef area very clean of algae.
It's almost like free-range sea ranching. Just by putting these crabs out onto isolated reefs that are completely covered in macroalgae, they were able to affect just about an 85% reduction in the cover, the percent of the reef that's covered in macroalgae, within a year.
The coral growth rate is booming, and the projection for the next few years looks good. But what about the next 100 years?
We are looking at future ocean conditions, so we can test our corals under different temperatures, acidification levels, predictions from the future. So basically we know what we think it's going to be 100 years from now, and we're able to test the corals that we have on site and see if they're going to do better in certain conditions.
To know which corals, when climate change occurs, which will survive and which won't.
Yes.
Is the idea then to encourage that growth and have those be replanted?
Yeah, and having that background information then informs us as restoration practitioners on which corals we want to grow more.
I am so glad to hear that someone is planning that far ahead for our oceans in the future. That's excellent. And thanks to the fast, effective action from so many dedicated people, the future is looking better every day.
The second we put out coral, we see more life come into an area. And as that coral continues to grow and to create big thickets and areas for other fish and other species to come in, it's incredibly heartwarming to see our reef come back to life.
It was surprising to me to see how quickly the other marine life is feeding off it and using it as a nursery and using it to protect from predators, just how alive that area is that you've replanted so recently.
Yeah, well, this is one of the fastest growing species in the Caribbean, and so it's going to be really critical for recovering critical fish habitat and habitat for the rest of the reef organisms that has been lost. We're so excited how successful this has been, and we hope to continue doing this as long as we can.
We're seeing coral that we've spawned here on land, raised from baby to fragment, to multiple fragments, to outplant, to fusion, and then watching them reproduce in just a matter of 5 years or so, which is incredible. That's the best amount of success we can hope for.
Coral will always need our help to be more responsible with waste, microplastics, and chemicals we use. With our help and a commitment from so many people around the country, I think there is hope for Florida's coral reef and every animal that thrives on it.
You know, a lot of people around the world heard about the manatee crisis we're still facing here in Florida. And I'd say to them that the coral crisis is just as important. The health of the coral reefs is the health of our oceans, and the health of our oceans is the health of our planet. And so if you're remotely interested in having a healthy planet, then you should be concerned about what's happening down here in Florida's reefs.
Ultimately, we have to have the right people in the right positions, including Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, AZA, and NOAA Fisheries, who all help lead this effort. We see a problem out in the natural environment, and we're able to react to it.
This has never been done before. This is an adventure that there's no blueprint for. We want to be able to tell our kids, our grandkids, that when Mother Nature in our own backyard needed us, we responded.
Though the reef may have taken thousands of centuries to build, like all wildlife habitats, it could be destroyed in a lifetime. The reef is an eloquent reminder of the riches that can be ours if we value and protect every part of the wild kingdom.